This little passage here actually is a very enculturated passage, little sentence. Because if you didn't have a tribe back in those days, you had no protection. And that little phrase right there, I will bless those who bless you, and the one who curses you I will curse, is a little liturgy. It's a little welcoming ritual for someone when they came into your tribe. And so what this means isn't that God has the hobby or the main job of cursing people. What it really means is that God is making Abraham and Sarah part of God's tribe. And to be a part of God's tribe means to be a blessing to everyone else. Now that's a little different. So if you understand it in a cross-cultural context, it means something really beautiful. But if you just read it from, sort of our own cultural context without doing any of that work, then really you're going to read something quite different. And so what we try to do at St. Paul's, and I think and to a large degree in Lutheran and Episcopal churches all around the country, is to try to interpret the Scripture as much as possible within its own context, so that we can discern the direction the writer was leading people in his or her own day. This direction helps us to see what kind of leadership, what kind of cultural change we might be called to provide. And in the midst of Scripture, as for Christians, Jesus' leadership is primary. It kind of trumps all the rest of them. So culture in biblical times was very different from our own. I mean, so different that it's hard for us to even get our head around it. First of all, they couldn't just go down to Safeway and get their food. Survival for them was an extremely challenging full-time occupation that required all hands on deck all the time. If they were tired when they came in from a day of work, they couldn't stop by Safeway or Costco and pick up one of those nice little, rotisserie chickens. They just couldn't do that. What they did primarily was subsistence farming. And so there were lots of competing tribes and nations all around them. The people of Israel had one big power after another come through and take over their land. But here's the really big one. There was a 30-year average lifespan for human beings. Now, it might even be a little bit less than that. It might have been 26 years. But it's not very long. I'm already a really old man, not just to my 16-year-old daughters, but to them. 18% of babies, and this is the tough one here too, survive to reproduce. 18%. So one quarter of all babies that were brought to term died. 1/4 of all mothers giving birth died. By age 1, another 25% of those that remained died. By the age of 6, another 25% had died. By the age of 12, another 25% had died, leaving roughly 18% of babies brought to term survived to reproduce. And then it all started over again. So how did they respond to this challenging, kind of survival climate? Well, they did it with tradition. We think of traditions as something that you can kind of take or leave. For them, it was a matter of survival. You did not have enough calories available to you for entrepreneurial activity. We think about this incredible energy crisis we have going on right now. And the key thing coming out of our culture about it is we're going to innovate our way out of it. We're going to find somebody who does some kind of fusion thing. And then pretty soon we'll all be able to have as big a computers as we want to because it won't matter. We'll find a way to innovate our way out of it. That's not their response. Because they only had so many calories. And so they had to do this year what they had done last year. So their traditions around production of basic needs, keeping food, keeping their flocks, making their clothes, was all geared toward helping them retain the kind of knowledge it took for them to survive from year to year. They had intense traditionalism in family and in tribal relationships, which we only barely glimmer a little bit of as our country has engaged in a conflict in the Middle East. And we hear about these retribution sort of things going on and the way you have to work with different tribal leaders. Well, that's the way the culture was in Old Testament and New Testament times. They also had very intense moral codes. And they also had something that we're not familiar with generally in America, which is called purity laws. But just because we're not familiar with the word purity law doesn't mean we don't have some. And I'll explain a little bit about that a little bit later. So, family and tribal relationships, this is from Exodus. Here's just one example of a sense of their tradition. When a man sells his daughter as a slave, let's just stop right there. Anybody here sell their daughter as slave? And how many of you are planning to? Well, my daughters were 14. I think I considered it, though. I will say that. And I am recording this, so sorry, girls, but that's the way it goes. So, but then it goes on. And she shall not go out as the male slaves do, if she does not please her master, who designated him for himself. Then he shall let her be redeemed. He shall have no right to sell her to a foreign people, since he has dealt unfairly with her. So in our culture, generally, we would say that to sell your daughter as a slave is morally wrong. Notice that the scripture doesn't seem to have any problem with it here in Exodus chapter 21. This is right in the same vicinity as the Ten Commandments, by the way. Right? We're not talking about the hinterlands. We're talking about pretty close to the Ten Commandments. You look at the Ten Commandments, flip the page, and there's where you are. All right? Now, here's the thing. The reason that a father would sell his daughter as a slave is the same reason that we don't. It's because they loved her. He loved her. Because that your household might not have enough calories to keep her alive. You might not have enough money to have a dowry to give her to a husband. And so at least here she'd be able to live out of one of the basic laws, one of the basic requirements for a Jewish woman, which is to be fruitful and multiply. Notice that the master had sexual relationships with his slaves. Did you notice that? Okay. Do we tend to do that here today? No, we wouldn't say that's so good either. But there is a direction in this text. And the direction is that the people of Israel, unlike other nations, saw that this vulnerable woman deserved some protection. And so if her master didn't like her, he couldn't sell her. He had to give her back to her original family. So there is a kind of leadership direction toward protecting the vulnerable that is quite beautiful. But the overall moral and ethical issue here is that we don't feel selling daughters as slaves is proper. Just a little bit improper. So anyone who maims another, it says in Leviticus 24, shall suffer the same injury in return, fracture for fracture, eye for eye, tooth for tooth. The injury inflicted is the injury to be suffered. Now, we all know somebody else had something to say about this passage. Does that ring a bell for anybody? Jesus! Right now, we've got to get into the habit here. Those of you who don't attend church very often, whenever there's any question from a pastor, it's always Jesus. That's always the answer. Okay? So Jesus had something to say. He said, you've heard it said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. Well, he was being humorous. They hadn't heard it said. It was in the scripture. It was like part of what they read all the time. And it sounds like this is terrible. Again, vengeance is really good. But remember I talked a minute ago about how families and people are in tribes, and your tribe is your protection, right? And so if you two are different tribes, and one of you goes over here and it hurts somebody, you've not just hurt that individual, you've actually attacked the entire tribe. And if they don't respond more violently than you did, their honor is at stake. And their status will go down among all the surviving tribes, and they don't dare do that because that means they could get attacked. And so what the writer of Leviticus in this portion of it is trying to say is let's limit retribution from escalating, and let's make it exactly equal. And that way we keep wars from breaking out. So as terrible as it is, as really unethical as this is, eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, it was a certain kind of ethical direction when you read it in its context culturally.